A man in England can still, technically, be prosecuted for taking a wild swan that isn't his, and the reason traces back to a crime once treated almost as seriously as treason itself. Here's why that's actually the law. Since the 12th century, every unmarked mute swan swimming in open water in England and Wales has belonged to the Crown. Not most swans, all of them. Edward IV formalized it in 1482, and the logic made sense at the time. Swans were a delicacy, reserved for royal banquets and noble feasts, and controlling the supply meant controlling status itself. For centuries, harming or taking a royal swan wasn't treated as simple theft, it was treated as an offense against the crown directly, punishable far more harshly than ordinary poaching. That changed formally in 1998, when Britain abolished treason, level penalties for offenses like this. Today, taking or killing an unmarked swan is prosecuted as wildlife crime and criminal damage. Still illegal, still tied to crown ownership, just no longer framed as an act against the monarch. Personally. But here's the part that makes no sense today. The ownership law itself was never repealed. It just quietly changed categories. The Crown still legally owns those birds. The Crown still counts them every July in a tradition called swan-upping, where the King's swan marker literally rows down the Thames marking birds by hand. Try explaining that to a police officer today. I didn't know it was still technically the Crown's property. It wouldn't hold up, and that's exactly the point. Britain never bothered to clean up its old laws. It just let the ownership sit there, dormant, waiting. And swans were just the beginning. Because if the king owns the birds on the river, wait until you hear what he used to own on the road. In parts of Britain, it was once illegal to be drunk in a pub while also being in possession of a cow. This sounds invented. It isn't. The Licensing Act of 1872 made it a specific offense to be found intoxicated while in charge of cattle, horses, steam engines, or carriages on any public highway. Cattle. Not cars, cows. The reasoning wasn't as absurd as it sounds once you understand the context. Rural England in the 1870s ran on livestock the way modern Britain runs on traffic. A drunk farmer leading an unpredictable animal through a crowded market town was a genuine public hazard. Stampedes, trampled pedestrians, overturned carts. So Parliament wrote a law for it. A very specific, very literal law. And it's still technically on the books. Here's the absurd consequence. Because the statute was never repealed, and because it names cattle explicitly rather than vehicles generally, legal commentators have pointed out for decades that a modern British citizen could, in theory, be prosecuted for having one too many pints while walking a cow home. Nobody has tested this in court recently, mostly because almost nobody in Britain walks a cow home from the pub anymore. But the law doesn't care that the world moved on. It just sits there, unbothered, still technically enforceable, waiting for exactly the wrong farmer on exactly the wrong Friday night. That law is oddly specific. But it's nothing compared to what Parliament decided to do about people wearing armor to work. In 1313, it became illegal to wear a suit of armor inside the Houses of Parliament. This wasn't ceremonial paranoia. It was a direct response to something that had actually happened. Members of the English nobility had developed a habit of showing up to political sessions armed and armored, not for tradition, but for intimidation. Debates were being settled less by argument and more by the implicit threat of a fully equipped knight standing in the room. So Parliament banned it outright. No armor. No weapons. If you wanted a vote, you came unarmed like everyone else. Here's the enforcement detail that makes this one land. The law is still cited today, almost 700 years later, as the legal basis for a real modern rule. Members of Parliament are still not permitted to enter the chamber wearing a suit of armor or carrying a weapon, including according to parliamentary guidance. Ceremonial swords worn as part of certain uniforms. In 1997, this actually came up. A newly elected MP asked, only half joking, whether he'd need special permission to enter in his territorial army dress uniform, which included a sword. He was told the sword would need to stay outside. 700 years, and the rule never needed updating. Once you legislate against knights showing up in full plate mail, it turns out you've also, accidentally, banned every future soldier's ceremonial blade. But strange as that is, nothing tops what British law decided to do about a fish. Under the Salmon Act of 1986, it is a specific criminal offence in England and Wales to handle salmon in suspicious circumstances. Not steal salmon. Not sell stolen salmon. Handle it suspiciously. Here's what that actually means in practice. The law targets anyone in the supply chain, buyer, seller, transporter, who receives or deals in salmon, they reasonably ought to have known was illegally caught, even without hard proof of exactly who stole it or when. It's built on the same legal logic as handling stolen goods charges, just written specifically for one fish. The reason it exists is straightforward once you know the backstory. By the 1980s, salmon poaching had become organized, profitable, and hard to prosecute. Ordinary theft laws required proving the original theft, which was often impossible once a fish had passed through 2 or 3 hands and started looking like legitimate stock. So Parliament lowered the bar. Instead of proving theft, prosecutors only had to prove the circumstances looked wrong. Try imagining that conversation with a police officer. "Sir, can you explain why you're handling this salmon suspiciously?" It's a real question. A real person could legally be asked under a real statute, in modern Britain, and it's not a technicality nobody uses. The Salmon Act remains actively enforced today. Environment Agency officers still rely on it to prosecute illegal salmon trafficking, and it's considered one of the more effective tools against poaching gangs operating along British rivers, precisely because it doesn't require catching anyone in the act of stealing, only catching them holding fish that never should have reached their hands. A 700-year-old armor ban, a cow and pub law from the 1870s, and a fish crime built entirely around suspicion. But the strangest one, the one that connects back to where we started, is still waiting. Here's the detail that makes the Swan law even stranger than it first sounds. The Crown doesn't just own unmarked swans on open water. Legally, the monarch owns every unmarked mute swan in England and Wales, full stop, including, technically, ones that wander onto private land, swim through someone's garden pond, or nest on a farmer's private lake. Which means, in theory, a swan can trespass onto your property, eat your fish, damage your garden, and you still don't own it. It remains the king's. You simply host it. That's the real absurdity underneath this one. It was never really about the eating, and it's no longer about treason either. That part of the law quietly disappeared in 1998. What survived is something stranger. Ownership so total, so historically entrenched, that Britain never got around to letting it go, even as the rest of the legal system modernized around it. The crime changed categories. The Crown's claim never did. Armor banned from Parliament, drunk cattle, handling outlawed, suspicious salmon, criminalized, a bird owned by the Crown no matter whose garden it lands in. None of these laws were written to be strange. Each one solved a real problem, for a specific moment, in a specific century. Britain just never cleaned up after itself. The laws didn't expire, they just stopped making sense. That's really the through line here. Governments have always tried to control the small, everyday stuff. What you eat, what you wear, what you're doing near livestock after a few pints. Most of those rules just fade quietly. In Britain, a surprising number of them never did. Which of these 5 would get you arrested today? Tell me in the comments.